The Sign of the Beaver by Elizabeth George Spear. A Dell Yearling book. A Newberry Honor book. Reading level 5.7. Chapter 10. He felt weak with relief when next morning Attean walked stiffly into the cabin and sat down at the table. Stumbling over himself, he set about the lesson. As soon as he could, he picked up Robinson Crusoe. In the night, he had carefully thought out just what he was going to say if Attean ever gave him another chance. Now he had to talk fast, because he could see that Attean was set against hearing any more of this book. "Let me go on," he pleaded. "It's different from now on. Friday, that's what Robinson Crusoe named him, doesn't kneel any more." "Not slave?" "No," Matt lied. "After that they get to be, well, companions. They share everything together." Ignoring the suspicion on Attean's face, Matt began hurriedly to read. He was thankful that he knew the book so well that he was able to see when trouble might be coming. One of the first words Crusoe taught his man Friday was the word master. Luckily he caught that one in time. And it was true. Crusoe and his new companion did go about together, sharing their adventures. Only Matt thought it would have been better perhaps if Friday hadn't been quite so thick-headed. After all, there must have been a thing or two about that desert island that a native who had lived there all his life could have taught Robinson Crusoe. When Matt closed the book, Attean nodded. Then, as many times before, he took Matt by surprise. "You like go fish?" he asked. "I sure would," Matt said gratefully. Stopping to pick up his fish-pole from beside the door, he ran to overtake the Indian boy, who strode ahead. He knew his grin was stretching from one ear to the other, but he couldn't hide his feelings as Attean did. They walked some distance, Matt managing to keep pace with the Indian's swift stride, determined not to let Attean know that his ankle was aching. They seemed to be following no particular trail. Finally they came out on a part of the creek that Matt had not seen before. It was shallow here, studded with rocks and pebbles, so that the water rippling over them made little rapids or collected in quiet pools. Here Attean stopped, broke off a sapling, and instead of making a fish-pole, drew his knife from his pouch and quickly shaved a sharp point, making a spear. Then he stepped gently into the stream. Matt stood watching. Attean stood motionless, peering intently into a pool of clear water. All at once he stooped, darted his spear with one stroke, and came up with the glittering fish. He studied it for a moment. "Too small," he decided. To Matt's astonishment, he spoke to the fish quite solemnly, a few incomprehensible words, then tossed it back into the stream. In a few moments he had speared another, which he judged large enough to keep. "Do same," he ordered now, coming back to the bank. He handed Matt the spear. He would just look ridiculous, Matt knew before he started. He waded in and stood up to his knees, looking down into the sliding water. Presently a fish darted past. At least he thought it was a fish. It was hard to tell which was shadow and which might be a fish. At any rate, it was gone before he got his spear into the water. Presently he saw another, and this one quite definitely a fish, calmly drifting in the pool. He jabbed at it hopelessly. He was sure his stick actually touched the slippery thing. He lunged at it, lost his footing, and went down with a splash that would scare off any fish for miles around. When he came up dripping, he saw Attean watching him with a horrid grin. Suddenly he felt hot in spite of the icy water. Why had Attean brought him out here anyway? Had Attean just wanted to show off his own cleverness and to make Matt look more clumsy than ever? Was this Attean's answer, in case Matt had any idea in his head about being a Robinson Crusoe? For a moment Matt glared back at Attean with a scowl as black as any Indian's. Then he wiped his nose on the back of his hand and sloshed back to the bank. He snatched up his own pole and line. He poked about under the wet leaves and found a good juicy worm and fitted it to his hook. "I'll do it my own way," he said. "I can catch plenty of fish with this, and that's what matters." Attean sat on the bank and watched. To Matt's satisfaction, in no time there was a tug on the line, a strong one. An impressive-looking fish rose to the surface, thrashing fiercely. Matt gave it a jerk, and the line came swinging out of the water so suddenly that he almost lost his footing again. It was empty. "Fish broke line," Attean observed. As if anyone couldn't see that. Furious at Attean, at the fish, and at himself, Matt examined the break, unable to face the Indian. He had lost more than a good fish. His hook had disappeared as well. The only hook he had. Of course Attean noticed. Those black eyes never missed anything. Make no new hook, he suggested. Without even getting to his feet, he reached out and broke a twig off a maple sapling. Out came the crooked knife again. In a few strokes he cut a piece as long as his little finger, carved a groove around the middle, and whittled both ends into sharp points. Now he stepped into the water and tied Matt's line expertly around the groove. Put on 2 worms, he said. Cover up all hook. He didn't offer to find the worms. Matt had lost all interest in fishing. He knew that somehow or other he would just provide more amusement for Attean, but he couldn't refuse. He didn't have to wait long before another fish caught hold. This time he landed it neatly. Good, said Attean from the bank. Big. Matt was trying to get it off the line. You swallowed the whole hook, he said. Better white man's hook, Attean said. Turn around inside fish, not get away. Back on the bank, Matt slit the fish and extracted the hook in his line, but the thin twig had broken in half. Easy make new hook, Attean said. Make many hooks. Of course, looking down at the simple thing in his hand, Matt realized that he'd never again need worry about losing a hook. He could make a new one wherever he happened to be. It was just another necessary thing that Attean had shown him, just as he had made the snare. He wasn't sure why Attean had bothered, but grudgingly he had to admit that Attean had proved to him once again that he didn't always have to depend on white man's tools. All at once he was hungry. The sun was straight overhead, and it would be a long tramp back through the woods before he could cook his fish. Now he saw Attean had the same thought. The Indian was heaping up a small pile of pine needles and grass. He blew from his muskrat skin pouch a piece of hard stone with bits of quartz embedded in it. Striking it with his knife, he soon had a spark, which he blew into a flame. I could have done that myself, Matt thought. In fact, he had done it many a time, but he had not realized that he could use a common stone as well as his flint. Get fish ready, Matt ordered now, pointing to the 2 fish on the bank. Matt did not like his masterful tone, but he did as he was told. By the time he had the 2 fish split and gutted and washed in the creek, Attean had a fire blazing. Matt was curious to see how he would go about the cooking. He watched as Attean cut 2 short branches, bending them first to make sure they were green. He trimmed and sharpened them rapidly. Then he thrust a pointed end into each fish from head to tail. A small green stick was set crosswise inside the fish to hold the sides apart. He handed 1 stick to Matt. One on each side of the fire, the 2 boys squatted and held their sticks to the blaze. From time to time, Attean fed the fire with dry twigs. When the flesh was crisp and brown, they ate, still silently. Matt licked his fingers. His resentment had vanished along with his hunger. Golly, he said, that was the best fish I ever ate. Good, said Attean. Across the fire he looked at Matt and his eyes gleamed. He was laughing again, but somehow not with scorn. What did you say to that fish you threw back? Matt was still curious. I say to him not to tell other fish, Attean said seriously, not scare away. You actually think a fish could understand? Attean shrugged. Fish know many things, he replied. Matt sat pondering this strange idea. Well, it seemed to work, he said finally. At least the other fish came along. A wide grin spread slowly across Attean's face. It was the first time Matt had seen him smile. Chapter 11. One morning Matt laid his sticks in a row, 7 sticks, each with 7 notches. That meant that it was well into August. The silk tassels were glistening on the cornstalks. The hard green pumpkins nestling underneath the stalks were rounding out and taking on a coating of orange. It was time for his father to be coming. At any moment he might look out and see him walking into the clearing, bringing his mother and Sarah and the new baby. It was strange to think there was a member of the family he had never seen. Was it a boy or girl? It would be a fine thing to have them sitting around the table again. He hoped his mother would take over the reading lessons, which were going badly. Attean still came almost every day, though there was no longer any need for him to bring meat or fish. Matt couldn't make out why the Indian kept coming, since he made it so plain he disliked the lessons. So often Attean made him feel uncomfortable and ridiculous, but he had to admit that on the days when Attean did not come, the hours went by slowly. Often Attean seemed in no hurry to leave when the morning's lesson was over. Look, see if catch rabbit, he might suggest, and together they would go out to check the snares. Or they would tramp along the creek to a good spot for fishing. Attean seemed to have plenty of time on his hands. Sometimes he would just hang around and watch Matt do the chores. He would stand at the edge of the corn patch and look on while Matt pulled up weeds. "Squaw work," he commented once. Matt flushed. "We think it's a man's work," he retorted. Attean said nothing. He did not offer to help. After a time he just wandered off without saying goodbye. It must be mighty pleasant, Matt thought to himself, to just hunt and fish all day long and not have any work to do. That wasn't his father's way, and it wouldn't ever be his. The work was always waiting to be done. But if he got the corn patch cleared and the wood chopped today, he could go fishing with Attean tomorrow, if Attean invited him. Sometimes Attean brought an old dog with him. It was about the sorriest looking hound Matt had ever seen, with a coat of coarse brown hair, a mangy tail, and whitish patches on its face that gave it a clownish look. Its long pointed nose was misshapen with bumps and bristles. By the look of its ears it had survived many battles. The instant it spied Matt, a ridge of hair went straight up on its back, and it let out a mean growl. Attean cuffed it sharply, and after that it was quiet, but it watched the white stranger with wary eyes and kept its distance. Matt tried not to show his own distrust. "What's his name?" he asked politely. Attean shrugged. "No name. Aramis. Dog." "If he doesn't have a name, how can he come when you call him?" "Him my dog. Him come." As though he knew what Attean had said, the scruffy tail began to weave back and forth. "Piz what?" Attean said. "Good for nothing. No good for hunt. No sense. Him fight anything. Bear, moose." There was no mistaking the pride in Attean's voice. "What's wrong with his nose?" Attean grinned. "Him fight anything. Chase cowga, what white men call needles all over." "Oh, a porcupine. Golly, that must have hurt." "Pull out many needles, some very deep, not come out. Dog not feel them now." Maybe not, Matt thought, but he doubted those quills had improved the dog's disposition. He didn't fancy this dog of Attean's. During the lesson the dog prowled about outside the cabin and finally thumped down on the path to bite and scratch at fleas. When Attean came out, the dog leaped up, prancing and yapping as though Attean had been gone for days. Matt thought a little better of him for that. It minded him how his father's dog had made a fuss every time his father came home. That old hound must have just about wagged its tail off when his father came back from Maine. The fact was, Matt was a little jealous of Attean. A dog would be mighty fine company here in the woods, no matter how scrawny it looked. But not this one. No matter how often the dog came with Attean, he never let Matt touch him, nor did Matt like him any better. He was certainly no good at hunting. When the two boys walked through the woods, the dog zigzagged ahead, sending squirrels racing up trees and jays chattering and ruining any chance of a catch. Matt wondered why Attean wanted him along. Attean didn't pay him any mind except to shout at him and cuff him when he was too noisy. But for all his show of indifference, it was plain to Matt that Attean thought a sight of that dog. Attean had not brought the dog with him the day that he led Matt a long distance into a part of the forest that Matt had never seen. Following after him, Matt began to feel uneasy. If Attean should take himself off suddenly, as he had a way of doing, Matt was not sure he could find his way back to the cabin. It occurred to him that Attean knew this, that perhaps Attean had brought him so far just to show him how helpless he really was, how all the words in a white man's book were of no use to him in the woods. Yet he did not think this would happen. For some reason he could not explain to himself, he trusted Attean. He didn't really like him. When the Indian got that disdainful look in his eyes, Matt hated him. But somehow, as they had sat side by side day after day doing the lessons that neither of them wanted to do, something had changed. Perhaps it had been Robinson Crusoe or the tramping through the woods together. They didn't like each other, but they were no longer enemies. When they came upon a row of short tree stumps, birch and aspen cut off close to the ground, Matt's heart gave a leap. Were there settlers nearby, or Indians? There was no proper clearing. Then he noticed that whoever had cut the trees had left jagged points on each. No axe would cut a tree that way. He could see marks where the trees had been dragged along the ground. In a few steps the boys came out on the bank of an unfamiliar creek. There Matt saw what had happened to those trees. They had been piled in a mound right over the water from one bank to the other. Water trickled through them in tiny cascades. Behind the piled-up branches, a small pond stretched smooth and still. "It's a beaver dam!" he exclaimed. "The first one I've ever seen." "Quabit," said Attean. "Have red tail. Ver beaver wigwam." He pointed to a heap of branches at one side, some of them new with green leaves still clinging. Matt stepped closer to look. Instantly there was the crack of a rifle. A ring of water rippled the surface of the pond. Near its edge a black head appeared just for a flash and vanished again in a splutter of bubbles. Attean laughed at the way Matt had started. "Beaver make big noise with tail," he explained. "I thought someone had shot a gun," Matt said. "I wish I had my rifle now." Attean scowled. "Not shoot," he warned. "Not white man, not Indian. Young beaver not ready." He pointed to a tree nearby. "Sign of beaver," he said. "Belong to family." Carved on the bark, Matt could make out the crude figure of an animal that could, with some imagination, be a beaver. "Sign show beaver house belong to people of beaver," Attean explained. "By and by, when young beaver all grown, people of beaver hunt here. No one hunt but people of beaver." "You mean just from that mark in the tree another hunter would not shoot here?" "That our way," Attean said gravely. "All Indian understand." Would a white man understand? Matt wondered. He thought of Ben with his stolen rifle. It wasn't likely Ben would respect an Indian sign, but he must remember to warn his father. When it seemed the beaver did not intend to show itself again, the two boys climbed back up the bank. At the row of stumps, Attean halted and signaled for Matt to go ahead. "Show way to cabin," he ordered. All Matt's suspicions came rushing back. Did Attean intend to sneak off behind his back and leave him to find his own way home? "Is this some kind of trick?" he demanded hotly. Attean looked stern. "Not trick," he said. "Matt need learn." To Matt's relief, he took the lead again. After a short distance, he stopped and pointed to a broken stick leaning in the direction of the creek. A little farther on there was a small stone set against a larger one. Not far away, a tuft of dried grass dangled from the branch of a small tree. "Indian make sign," Attean said. "Always make sign to tell way. Matt must same, not get lost in forest." Now Matt remembered how Attean had paused every so often, sometimes to break off a branch that hung in their path, once to nudge a stone aside with the toe of his moccasin. He had done those things so quickly that Matt had paid no mind. He saw now that Attean had carefully been leaving markers. "Of course!" he exclaimed. "But my father always made blazes on the trees with his knife." Attean nodded. "That might white man's way. Indian maybe not want to show where he go, not want hunters to find beaver house." So these were secret signs, nothing anyone following them would notice. It would take sharp eyes to find them, even if you knew where they were. "Matt do same," Attean repeated. "Always make sign to show way back." Matt was ashamed of his suspicions. Attean had only meant to help him. If only he didn't have to be so superior about it. He plodded along behind Attean, trying to spot the signs before Attean could point them out. All at once, as a thought struck him, he almost laughed out loud. He remembered Robinson Crusoe and his man Friday. He and Attean had sure enough turned that story right round about. Whenever they went a few steps from the cabin, it was the brown savage who strode ahead, leading the way, knowing just what to do and doing it quickly and skillfully, and Matt, a puny sort of Robinson Crusoe, tagged along behind, grateful for the small sign that he could do anything right. It wasn't that he wanted to be a master, and the idea of Attean's being anyone's slave was not to be thought of. He just wished he could make Attean think a little better of him. He wanted Attean to look at him without that gleam of amusement in his eyes. He wished that it were possible for him to win Attean's respect. As though Attean sensed that Matt was disgruntled, he stopped, whipped out his knife, and neatly sliced off 2 shining gobs of dried sap from a nearby spruce. He grinned and held out one of them like a peace offering. "Chaw," he ordered. He popped the other piece into his mouth and began to chew with evident pleasure. Gingerly Matt copied him. The gob fell to pieces between his teeth, filling his mouth with a bitter juice. He wanted to spit it out in disgust, but Attean was plainly enjoying the stuff, so he stubbornly forced his jaws to keep moving. In a moment the bits came together in a rubbery gum, and the first bitterness gave way to a fresh piney taste. To his surprise it was very good. The two boys tramped on, chewing companionably. Once more Matt acknowledged to himself Attean had taught him another secret of the forest.